And we're live.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, committee and members of the public. For the next maybe hour or so, we're going to be talking about the capital investment program proposal from capital investment projects proposal from the administration and the changes they'd like to see with it. It's a great deal of money being suggested to put into these grants, and one of the remaining questions we have in our economic development bill is what kind of legislative statutory restrictions or guardrails or benefits we're going to put on this program, or are we just going to accept what the administration suggests we do? So with that, I think I see David Hall with us. If David Hall could David, if you could just put up on the screen what we have so far in terms of a proposal on changes to the capital investment program and walk us through that, and then we'll move to the administration and then follow up with the auditor and Tom Cavet's thoughts on what they've heard.
Mr. Chairman.
Do you have a time restriction set?
No, but I just want to make a point. I don't know when you're going to hear from me, but if you delay it too long, you'll miss something interesting. It's sort of like Houston, we have a problem. Reviewing the final rule, I'm not persuaded that the program as designed meets the requirements of the rule. I think you have a serious problem.
Well, yeah, okay. Thank you for bringing it up. We will definitely do better time management on this half of the meeting than we did on the first half. So, so let's start with David and pull up what we're dealing with here.
Good morning, David Hall, Legislative Counsel. Are you seeing the capital investment program on your screen?
We are. Thank you, David.
Great. So this is section 2 of the proposed strike-all amendment to S263, and you'll see, in A1 here, as the bill passed last year, it had a $10.58 million appropriation, and obviously there's a proposal to increase the amount. I think it's still up in the air what the increase should be, whether there should be an increase, whether it's new ARPA funds, whether it's moved from another ARPA source, et cetera. But as sort of a placeholder concept, there's the threshold question about the dollars available to the program.
And let me just jump in there as an overview. There's also the $30 million that's being proposed for towns with stagnant grand lists, which is designed to operate very similar to this program for another $30 million. And the public and the committee will remember last year the governor had proposed this program at over 3 years at $30 million for each of the 3 years. So we only gave him $10 million. So the $80 million that's now on the table is consistent with that $90 million he originally proposed, but it's in a shorter time frame than he originally suggested last year. I'm sorry, David, I'll try not to interrupt.
No worries. So, I mean, most of this is existing law. I mean, you'll see the purpose is to make funding available for transformational projects that will provide each region with opportunity to attract business, retain existing business, create jobs, et cetera. And it's contemplated the agency would work with all kinds of partners, state and regional, to identify these projects and move them forward. So to be eligible, there's this proposed addition that an applicant shall comply with the Treasury rule implementing the recovery funds. I think that proposed language is harmless. It's also unnecessary. I mean, the federal law is going to apply whether you have this here or not. So this doesn't really make much difference. The criteria, you remember from the underlying law, it has to be in the state, for-profit or nonprofit, but there's an ownership requirement. You have to demonstrate regional support, leveraging if possible, management. You can't be a state or local government operated business, municipality, or a business with more than 20 locations, or a publicly traded company. So in C here, the award amount, eligible uses, right now, the way that this program is written in law, an award shall not exceed the lesser of $1.5 million or the estimated net state fiscal impact of the project based on agency modeling. So that's the hard cap. That's the quantitative limit on the amount of the award in current law. And the proposal here is to, one proposal is to change those numbers. Another is to get rid of modeling and the concept of net fiscal impact altogether, not have that be a functional limitation on the amount of an award. So that would, whatever happens, if it does change, that would happen here. You can use the property to the funds to acquire property, implement the project, etc. D, you see the strikeout here, data model approval. So right now, as written in law, agency is supposed to collaborate with the legislative economist to design a data model and related methodology to assess the fiscal, economic, and societal impacts of proposals and prioritize them based on the results. And the agency shall present the model and related methodology to the Joint Fiscal Committee for its approval as of September last year. So the strikeout obviously would remove the requirement that the legislative economists and the agency develop this model and that it be presented to JFC. It does say prioritize the projects based on results, but that, to me, read in tandem with the rest of the program, is sort of a ranking of what the net fiscal impact would be, but it is not the only basis for a decision, and it is not the basis of a decision. That discretion is vested with the Secretary of Commerce. So you'll see that in the next section here, rolling application process, information sharing among the administration, legislative, and executive economists. And the strikeout in 2, again, goes back to this data model. So right now, using the data model and methodology approved by JFC, the agency is supposed to analyze information provided in application to estimate the net state fiscal impact, including, this is not limited to, but includes increase to grant list value, improvements to supply chain, jobs, impact, state GDP. All that would be removed because the modeling concept is proposed to be eliminated. So you'll see in 3, the way this would work, though, is that Secretary of Commerce has this interagency team of all these various departments and agencies in the state, and they're supposed to analyze, review, recommend projects for funding based on the estimated state fiscal impact of a project and on other contributing factors that include sort of these qualitative, components, criteria of the proposal. So transformational nature, project readiness, collaboration with stakeholders, alignment with regional plans, creation of workforce opportunities, etc. So there's a quantitative modeled net fiscal impact analysis. There's the qualitative factors that are considered by the agency, interagency team. They take this presumably to the Secretary of Commerce, who has the final say over which project actually gets funded. And we have pieces about grant agreements and reporting. And the last strikeout here at the end is, references data and modeling again. So that would be removed if the concept of the data modeling is eliminated from the program. So that's what you have for the existing law and proposed changes to existing law. Do you want me to go on and talk about 2A or hold off on that for now?
Michael, have you frozen again?
No, I'm not frozen. I was
Okay.
on mute. Sorry. I think so. I'm not, is this an alternative proposal that was floating around from another bill? Or is this,
No, this is the concept of, guidelines take into JFC priority sectors if they can demonstrate more than average loss, et cetera. So it's a sort of a proposal, it's a concept for maybe modifying the grant program. I don't know if you want to talk about it.
So, yeah, let's go through it. This was not suggested by the administration. I think
Right.
it may have been suggested by me, but
Correct.
let's go on.
Sure. So, I suppose that this would work in tandem with accepting the changes to the capital investment grant program if you decided to do so. They'd ultimately have to be harmonized, but the concept here is the ACCD would consult with JFO to develop guidelines for the program and submit the proposed guidelines to JFC prior to accepting applications or awarding grants. And then under B here, when considering whether and how to prioritize economic sectors that have suffered harm, the agency may designate one or more sectors for priority consideration through the program, provided that it demonstrates that such sector has experienced above average economic harm and acquires additional or priority assistance. So
Okay.
that's 2A.
Okay. So that was just my attempt to not leave it totally without a second set of eyes outside of the administration on these grants. So thank you for that. Does anybody have any questions for David at this point before we move on to Brett?
Mr. Chair, may I clarify something?
Yes.
So, David, we went back and forth about this a little bit the other day. I just want to clarify that that regardless of the net fiscal impact modeling that is done currently, so I know there's a huge amount of work been put into this already. The secretary of ACCD at the moment, given all the inputs she gets, net fiscal impact, all the other criteria, and ARPA, she is able at the moment to take all that information and still make her own recommendations about what projects should be funded at what level. Is that correct?
I believe it is, and subject to the hard cap on the amount of the grant, but
Right.
yes.
So obviously, subject to the hard cap. So okay. So I just want to clarify for us all that at the moment, our law enables the secretary to take all these pieces into consideration and still make her own recommendation. Correct?
I believe that's the way it's written.
Okay, thanks. I just want to clarify that as we go into this conversation, because I think the concern, just to reiterate what the chair said, I think the concern for many of us is that the modeling may put undue constraints, unnecessary, big constraints on some of these grant amounts, and and in some ways undermine the objective of the program. So I just want to make that we're all clear that the secretary could take all this and still make her own choices.
Yeah, and that's what I always thought, but I thought also that having this information in front of the secretary would hopefully influence those decisions. And I wanted to ask whether, I assume all this information is available to the public as well. It may not be easily accessible, but if somebody wanted to look at the files on an application, that would be something that the press could do or an individual could do. Is that not true?
Subject to, Public Records Act protections for confidential business data.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to, in the absence of Commissioner Goldstein, I'm going to turn it over to Brett Long. And Brett, if you can explain why the agency is making the changes. I do think that Senator Clarkson makes a good point. I think we were told by the commissioner that this prioritization is really, you know, hurting the program, and the involvement of the economists is drawing things out. So there were a lot of criticism for the law as written, and I do think ultimately the law was designed to make sure there was a second set of eyes and there was a thorough evaluation, but the choices would still be in the secretary's hands. So with that introduction, uh, go ahead, and maybe Joan will join us before you're done.
Sounds good. I'm Brett Long. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic Development. There's a lot to unpack in the comments so far. I think the fundamental issue is that I think the net fiscal impact requirements are in conflict with the ARPA eligibility guidelines that are provided. In those guidelines, there are 4 general objectives or eligible uses for these ARPA funds. And they are replace lost public sector revenue, support COVID-19 public health and economic response, provide premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work, and invest in water, sewer, and broadband. And I think that from our standpoint, including the net fiscal impact requirement is confusing the lost public sector goal with the providing a economic response to those that have been impacted by COVID-19. So I think that's the fundamental issue that we have. I think, we didn't necessarily read the legislation the same way that David had described it. There are several spots there in the language that was deleted where there's seems to be a requirement for prioritization based upon net fiscal impact. I think we understood that that was a requirement rather than an option. So maybe the situation can be remedied just by some clarity around that. But I think fundamentally there is a question as to whether we're trying to provide the need or address the needs of households, businesses, and workers that have been impacted by COVID, or where we're trying to maximize the return on investment by the state.
Okay. So question I would have is it the department's position that the COVID or the ARPA guidelines in and of themselves are sufficient to run this program and to give out this money, and that there shouldn't be any other state-imposed directions?
Without getting too far into the weeds, I think that those guidelines do address a number of the concerns that you raised earlier in the discussion. They do lay out guidelines for what's an impacted industry, what's a disproportionately impacted industry, and the types of funding that can go to those different categories.
I guess, speaking for myself, I have to be convinced that this is tight in some way. We're talking about $80 million here. And to just say that the general federal guidelines control and here go spend it, something doesn't ring true. In the first instance, I think an average person is like, where'd you get the $80 million figure from? Could it have been 150? Could it have been 10? Some defense of that number. And we do have, I think we all have an issue that this program is sort of changing because of the ARPA guidelines. Maybe they weren't fully finalized back then, but it was sold to us on a very different scale than it is now. We were told these are going to be transformational projects, and we don't want a cap, or we want a cap of $3 million on a project. Now we're hearing about a daycare center or a general store. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly the ARPA guidelines have changed, and especially to the final rule. But the net fiscal impact calculation has a huge impact on the types and amounts of funding that we can provide. And daycare centers are probably one of the best examples. Tom can talk about this in a much more educated way than I can. But daycare centers are projects that have some employment, but that employment is at a very low rate. So there are situations where we've seen daycare centers potentially receiving less than $10,000 when they were asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars, because they don't generate a lot of net fiscal impact because they have low paid workers, and the net fiscal impact model assigns the same state costs regardless of what people are getting paid. So you get a very low net fiscal impact because you've got low revenues spread over the same costs. So it's a great example of the impact of net fiscal impact.
Well, okay, and so to continue this discussion, and Senator Clarkson, you have a question, right? I'll get to you in a second.
Yeah.
So, I think that a lot has changed with the federal guidelines for sure. But when we wrote this bill, we did give some flexibility, though I'll grant you that there was more words and more attention to the fiscal impact. And one of the reasons that is because the proposal that was presented to us was one that was going to say, these things are transformational. They're going to bring a great improvement to the economy of the state of Vermont. And we wanted proof of that. So now the program is changing. The skeptic in me says, if the program is changing and its target so much, why do we still need $80 million for it?
Well, I think I would probably attack the question the other way around, which is that the net fiscal impacts have such a huge impact on the amount of the award that there's not enough money to do anything with any of these projects that are truly transformational.
So just to be clear, are we considering improvements to a general store as transformational now still?
Well, again, you have to recall that there are several levels of filters that we're trying to run projects through. One of those is the legislation specifies or asks us to try to achieve geographic diversification of these awards. And, we're only able to deal with the applications that we receive. So when we look at applications that are coming in from some of the more rural areas of the state, a general store improvement is one of those applications that would allow us to achieve the goal of geographic diversification.
Okay. I guess I think we should, as policymakers, given that we have a new set of rules from the feds that we're working under, and the program is changing from transformational to a capital improvement program on a smaller scale, we shouldn't be necessarily locked into what we did last year, be it the prioritization for fiscal return or geographic. We're at liberty to do, if you assume we're going to appropriate $80 million, which I don't think is a given here, but if we assume, how do we best use that money? And we could start from scratch. We could write a 1-paragraph bill, which I think is probably what I'm hearing you say, just get this money out under the federal guidelines, and be anxious to hear from our next 2 witnesses why they might think we can do better than that. But Okay, unless you have, Senator Clarkson, you had a question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate this tension because it is a tension. I think sadly that once the Treasury rules came out, that we all had to shift our thinking of transformational with a capital T to transformational with a lowercase t. Childcare is transformational, accessible, affordable, open childcare is transformational for working families, particularly if it's region based, which some of these are, and would serve a large number of towns. I think we're having to rethink. I mean, and it's hard for me because, I was a champion of regionally impacted projects and projects that really had a big impact. But I think with the ruling, we're having to take it from a capital T to a small t, transformational, which does lead us to a slightly different project. And I think that's all I just wanted to add at this point. Thanks.
Okay, let's move on. I'm going to go to Doug. I know you both probably have time constraints, but Doug jumped in and said we had to hear his one point in the mix. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug. And Mr. Auditor, if you've heard the discussion thus far, I'm going to leave it to you to make any remarks you'd like in the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. As you know, these rules have changed. I don't want to focus on the interim rules, but the final rules make me concerned about whether this program as designed really meets the requirements of the rule at all. Eligibility, for example, the intent of the program is to respond to negative economic impacts of the pandemic. So if you have a business that does not meet the other eligibility criteria, which is more than 8% loss in employment and so forth, then just wanting to expand because they can, and it's a good idea and might be good for the business and hire more workers, that's fine, but that is not what the program is intended for. It is intended to respond directly to economic harm by entities identified by the recipient, which in this case is the state. Furthermore, the ACCD Notice of Funding Opportunity said that, among other things, the explicit objective of this plan is to provide long-term economic recovery opportunities with a focus on those with the greatest demographic declines over the last 20 years. That is not recognized as an economic harm. It simply is not. What's happened over 20 years may or may not be we can describe it, we can define it, we can explain it or not, but that 20 years is not related to the pandemic, period. It also says, the NOFO also said that making funding available for projects that will, quote, attract and retain business, create jobs, and so forth. Here too, the final rule explicitly says that this money is not intended to fund standard issue economic development goals, however desirable. That's not what this program is meant to do. The small business component of the program, and there's lots of others, as Mr. Long indicated, households, workers, communities, and so forth, which is all good. The entity has to have experienced economic harm due to the pandemic. And I looked through the materials, at least the ones I've seen, I could have missed something. But while the agency is asking applicants to describe harm, no thresholds were provided. That was, I think, because the applications were created before the final rule. I assume that's the case. But now, thankfully, no money has been sent out. I think the program has to be reworked to meet these new requirements. You have to go back to the world, and they're not going to like it. But that's the game. I mean, the federal government makes the rules. And I think, I was listening a few weeks ago, and Senator Clarkson said about the bridge gaps, that's for recovery. This stuff is for forward thinking, forward looking. Well, that's not really the way the rules are written. Applicants have to be given some guidance under the new rules, or the final rule, I should say. And I don't think that has happened yet, either under the funding guidelines or the application. There are some ways to become eligible for this kind of help, whether it's services related, cash grants, or capital. The simplified test is, does the industry that you presume has been impacted, has it experienced a loss of 8% or more in employment? And that's from before the pandemic to the latest data available, which I think is probably the third quarter of 21 or something like that. And I looked at that data. It's kind of interesting. You know, we're fortunate. We've had pretty good recovery in most industries and subsectors. There are some holdouts, as the federal government acknowledged. Tourism and hospitality, for sure, continues to be a problem. And that's fine as far as it goes. And housing is always a carve out, and that's, you know, justifiable. But eligibility here is a big deal. And as this program is currently designed, I would guess that a significant percentage of the applicants, unless there's information I haven't seen, and I'll ask for it, cannot demonstrate that they have, as of today, continued to be 8% or more below their employment levels from before the pandemic. And if not, they are not eligible. Now, there is one exception. If you're in a qualified census tract, then you can be considered an impacted entity. But there aren't many of those census tracts in the state. I think there's 15 or 20 or something to that order. And as for use of funds, the program, the federal guidelines or rules, I should say, it's very clear that there is a preference and a bias for services and not capital. That doesn't mean you can't do capital, but they said they really prefer capital. And I think, you know, the reasons are pretty clear if you think about it. The time required for a large construction project may make capital expenditures less responsive to a pandemic-related need. You know, if the business can't find workers today, then planning a 2-year construction project isn't going to solve that problem. Furthermore, larger projects, which is probably not the case for us. I don't know. I haven't seen the data that Tom's working with, but larger projects are probably less likely to be reasonably proportional to the harm identified. And that is a core component of the rules. First, you identify the economic harm and you make some effort to quantify it. The quantification is important because the response, however it's designed by the state, needs to be both related to that economic harm and proportional to it. So if a small-ish business, you know, is down 10 or 15 workers, we want to help them solve the problem, but a $4 or $5 million capital project isn't going to do it, and it's not proportional. So there's a lot of reasons why this makes sense. It's not going to make your applicants happy, but that's the game. This is about recovery, not long-term, more general economic development. Also, there's the question of duplication of benefits. The application that I looked at didn't ask any questions about the extent to which the applicants had received prior recovery-based monies, either from the PPP, EIDL, the ERG, and so forth. Now, obviously, the agency can do that because they have all that information, but I don't know whether they are. But personally, I would be concerned about some entities who've already been to the well, and appropriately, if they're qualified and deserve and need the monies from those earlier programs, then fine. But if this is another bite at the apple, I would want to add that to the analysis. And I don't think Tom has done that because I don't think the application asked for that information. So, you know, for all those reasons and others, I think you, the committee, need to step back and ask a very hard question. Maybe David can help you and dig into the rules. You know, it's long, it's tedious, but it's pretty straightforward. They prefer services to capital, A. Furthermore, this question, by the way, just before I forget, of changing the maximum award to 999, I'm not sure what that's intended to do, but what the rules say, which is kind of interesting and reinforces the Fed's concern about capital projects, says that if the total cost of a project is below $1 million, they're going to assume, of course, it's not for Vermont, but it's the world at large outside of here, they're going to assume that it's okay. And the state, for its part, and the entity seeking assistance don't have to justify it, as long as they meet the other requirements for eligible uses. If it's more than $1 million, they insist that the applicant and or the recipient prepare a written justification, which sounds like a real pain in the butt. A lot of work, and nobody would want that. But I think what they're saying is, look, our preference is for service. If you really insist on doing a capital project, tell us why this is the best way to go about it, why a service wouldn't be better, and so forth. That's a lot of work. And I'm sure that our small businesses wouldn't enjoy that at all, but that's what they said is required. So I don't know. I'm concerned about the current structure of the program in light of the final rule. I also would say that given the comments earlier about the request to remove the analysis done by Tom and colleagues, I don't know how one determines what's in the best interest of the state writ large without that kind of information. Otherwise, it is so subjective as to be, not the kind of professional approach to giving out millions of taxpayer dollars that I would prefer. Just call me crazy. The idea suggested by the chair, I guess maybe with others, I don't know, about seeking input from the JFC and assistance from the JFO is probably reasonable. It makes sense to me. There's too much at stake if in fact you allocate this much in resources. By the way, one more thing with regard to childcare, great issue, critical issue for the families of this state, particularly those who we want to get back into the workforce. It's expensive. In some areas, there are probably shortages of slots. But in the end, this is a question for the agency. If the state believes that childcare is a critical issue going forward, then what's the best approach? In areas where there is sufficient capacity, why would we give money to owners of childcare providers, childcare facilities to expand when you could solve the problem in the near term with giving parents more money? So, this whole program focuses exclusively on the business side, where I would argue that some of the analysis of what's the nature of the problem, have we defined the problem properly? And maybe solving the problem is working more with households and neighborhoods. I don't know. But this obviously is all about business. And to some extent, it may not be the best fit. So I don't envy you, but the rules are the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor. Any questions for Doug? Okay, before I go to Tom,
May I
you do have a question, I'm sorry.
No, I just want to say, Doug, thanks. I appreciate it. And I think lots of these projects are services, and I'm not sure we can't accomplish all of this. I would just say giving more money to parents, which we're, as you know, in the House intending to do. There is a whole proposal coming out of Ways and Means. I don't think that's mutually exclusive. The problem is you can give parents as much money as you want. If there's no childcare, they can't spend it on what they need. So I actually, while I agree with many of the things you say, because you always give us different perspectives and good things to chew on, and I appreciate, but that you could give parents as much money as you want. And if there's no childcare, and that is an industry whose staff and employees has been so devastatingly impacted, that, to me, that's just a hugely eligible service project business, and one that fails completely under the net fiscal impact analysis.
Okay, thank you. So before I go to Tom, the commissioner has joined us, and Commissioner, I'll take your comments, most of them after Tom talks, but I wanted to ask the question. Most of the conversation thus far has centered around, a lot of it has centered around the new guidelines. And it seems like you are proceeding with the applications you had under the rules established last year. And I think you've told us the checks are about to go out. Were you able to pivot and apply the new guidelines to the applicant pool that's pending to go out now?
So, hi, Joan Goldstein, Commissioner of Economic Development. So they're not new guidelines, they're final guidelines. So there's more clarity and there's more specificity. Everything we asked for from the applicants is still applicable. It's just that it'll exclude, because we had so many. We had over 125 applications, probably around 38 or 39 will be funded. So yes, Auditor Hoffer is correct. There will be a lot of disappointed folks, but we still had asked originally for folks to provide COVID impact. Fact of the matter is, we went with the ones who were most industry impacted as the final, kind of the prioritization. I think what you'll see in our original NOFO is trying to comply with all the additional state requirements that were put on by statute. And that, unfortunately, we will not be able to abide because the Fed trumps the state. The only thing that we will abide is the net fiscal impact. And I'm sure you already talked about that before, about what it does to some of these projects. And as the auditor said, and I said originally when we first came here, this session, is that this is recovery money. It's recovery money. It's not incentive money. Yes, it is difficult. All economic development is difficult. It doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to do. And you'll see checks aren't ready to go out, but we are trying to finalize our list, utilizing the final rule and getting the final determinations from Tom Cavett and his team and our team to explain away how this modeling worked, since so many people will be getting very small percentages of what the project is.
Okay. Thank you. You'll stay with us, and we're going to go past 11:30 if need be, which I think we will. But I know, Tom, thank you for being with us. I know you've had some travel travails, and it looks like you're in a good spot as opposed to an airport terminal. That's good. So welcome. And, I'm obviously interested in understanding, we have a proposal to sort of cut The Economist and JFO out of the process. I have a paragraph that sort of reinserts you in a different fashion. So I'd like to know your thoughts on that specifically, but on a general front, tell us what you've heard, what you can from what you've heard so far.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I am a couple thousand miles away. I had a family medical emergency that I had to fly out to New Mexico for yesterday. And the internet connection here, if it gets choppy, I may need to cut out the video portion. But anyway, we'll do our best. Last time I was asked about this by the committee, I said I would very much like to actually complete one project so that there's one award granted, or the first tranche is granted. I think it's going to come in a block, because I think that Joan is wanting to distribute those by region and balance them and all that, and I can understand that. But it makes it difficult to talk about it when we don't have an award that's actually, a set of awards, and we can say, okay, here's the group and here's the total, and this is what finally happened for daycare, or for pick a category or group of applicants, so that we can get into that. I understand also the reality of you're having to make decisions sometimes with incomplete information, and most importantly, I understand your challenge with respect to spending federal monies that are highly restrictive and enormous in size, and being constrained by all the federal rules around this. We've sort of been at the tail of that. We don't look at that in doing the economic analysis, but I know from ACCD that there were some applicants that came through early on and they said, wait, change in rules or reinterpretation of rules, and now these are off the table and these ones are on, so start modeling these ones. And it's definitely affected the whole process. I would start, I would also want to make clear that, you refer to this as me and my team. There are 5 people in the economic review group. One is from ACCD, Ken Jones. 2 are from our administration economists, Jeff Carr and Bob Chase with Economic and Policy Resources, and myself and Nick Rockler on behalf of the legislature. So it's a group of 5. Everything is done on a consensus basis. So it's not my whims about, one project or another. but it brings a certain kind of lens through which we look at trying to target projects where they will be most effective and most efficient in terms of impact. And the federal programs to date have been woefully inefficient and wasteful in the expenditure of vast amounts of money. There have been a slew of articles based on a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research on the PPP program, where it landed, how it exacerbated inequality. And, we talked about this when it was live because we could see the money's coming through. And it had a very low bar for qualification. And it washed over the economy, but many recipients received that were not negatively impacted at all. And it was perfectly legal, but it was not targeted. And because of that, there was a great deal of waste and also impacts that were not intended. And this money will end up the same way, any money that's federally out there, if there isn't a process for targeting. And I know there's tension between, well, how long does it take and what's the timing and everything else? But I'll push back on just even the economic impact analysis that's been done because it's complicated and evolved, especially with the externalities that we're looking at and trying to monetize that. But I don't. That is not what's been holding up release of an award. We're at the end of the process now, and we hope to be able to finalize stuff soon. But the list has been changing. The information the applicants provided was woefully inadequate in many cases and required numerous back and forth to get adequate information that was reasonable. I mean, you would not believe some of the stuff that came through on the applications. And I don't want to talk specifics now, but at some point, based on commentary earlier, to the extent this information is available by applicant to some degree, I think there will be enormous eye rolling and head scratching about, what was involved, because there are many that were not, that are entities that want to expand, they're doing good things and all the rest, but this is icing on the cake. This is extra profit margin. Very few are transformational, even with a lowercase t. But there are, but I think that both federal government and state government are not set up to disperse grants at of this magnitude with any existing program. And that's part of the problem with PPP and all the pandemic spending in general. So they wanted to get money out. They wanted to have something that would counter things. It ended up being way more than was needed to actually counter the economic effects, which is a big part of why we're seeing the inflation that we're seeing now. But it lacked targeting, and it lacked a mechanism to do that. You can just, let ACCD write checks for whatever they want to whomever they want. And probably a lot of good things would happen, but there would be a lot of money that was not necessary and really had no impact other than padding profitability of a project. It wasn't the thing that caused the project to occur. Also, based on what David just said about award levels, it sounds like the net fiscal impact part of things is not constraining any award to any daycare center. Sounds like Joan could give whatever amount she wants to. So there's guidance on net fiscal impact, but then there could be a decision that says, no, well, this is what we want to do. And it doesn't have to be in the, scale order, top to bottom. It's information for her and others. So if that's the case, that's kind of moot. I don't really care, to be involved with this in any way going forward. But if you don't have some review process that tries to focus targeting and provide some guardrails, you will waste a lot of money, and you will end up with some unbelievably humorous and wasteful projects. And I could go into some detail now, but I won't. I think I don't understand all the confidentiality limitations, and the process isn't finished. So we have yet to see how this thing even plays out. But I would be very wary of spending $50 million or more, or even another $10 million without having some sort of structure that tries to say, will this money really make a difference? Is this money that's going to change something that would, not have otherwise happened? And to these policy areas where there are problems, we have childcare, we have tourism, climate change, racial justice, downtown development. All of these things are legitimate and important areas of public policy concern. Just handing out money to people that are doing developments that happen to tangentially touch these subjects is not necessarily the best policy for solving what are very real problems that have that there's a big public interest in. Daycare, there is a problem with affordable daycare. That is different than saying there's a problem with market rate daycare. And we've done in a lot of these areas deeper dives than we would ever have done before. But the affordability side of it is really important. And we don't have anybody saying that they're going to charge less than market rate for the daycare slots they produce. There may be state funding available, and I applaud what you said, Allison, about beefing that up, because there is an affordability problem. We've had daycare centers close because they couldn't retain staff. Why can't they retain staff? They can't pay them enough. So they're not paying competitive rates in this market to retain staff. Why can't they pay them competitive rates? They can't raise their rates on the people that are using the service. If those people have money to express the demand for daycare at the clearing rate that they can hire people for, you will have for-profit daycare centers and even nonprofit ones flourishing. That's the point, though. If you just build more buildings and spend your money on construction, and again, there are big regional differences too, because if I take the total number of daycare slots that are licensed in the state, and I know this market includes a lot of unlicensed stuff and other things, but if we just look at the number of daycare slots in 2015 and 2020, and the total population age 0 to 4 in Vermont, there were 105%. So 105% is the ratio of the number of slots to the number of children 0 to 4 in the whole state. So that's in 2015. In 2020, there's 107% of the number of children 0 to 4. So that population cohort is declining over time. And we would expect the number of daycare slots to decline commensurate with that. Doesn't mean that everybody can get, daycare in their region, because you have regional imbalances, and that's an important aspect of it. And there are also differences in the age groups in daycare. So infants and toddlers are different than older children, and they make more money with the older children to subsidize the younger children because they require greater staffing to support it. But as a public policy problem, would you solve this problem by dishing out money in the tens of millions to people building and expanding daycare capacity for construction and things like that? Or would you beef up the subsidies to families, especially right on the margin? Because it's the families who can't get high-paying jobs that are most apt to enter the labor force if there were affordable daycare. It's not people at the high end that can afford au pairs or private people coming in, whatever. So you get a labor force response when you provide public assistance at the low end of the spectrum. That's where you get much more of a labor force response. So that would be a more effective way to spend the same money. I know that there are all kinds of constraints with this particular pot of money, and I could go into detail on each of these externality areas, but it's sometimes not just as simple as saying, oh, I'm for daycare or not for daycare. So anyway, that's where we're at now. I think we'll know more as soon as we finalize this first tranche and that money goes out, and then we can talk about where it went and how it landed and everything else. But I know you're time constrained too, so you may have to make decisions on that. I would recommend you have some kind of guardrails on a future program if you choose to fund it. It certainly doesn't have to be this sort of thing. I have no stake in this whatsoever. But I could certainly respond to any specific proposal anybody had on that.
Thanks. Mr. Chair, are you muted? No, you're not.
Randy has his hand up.
Right, I am muted. I was saying, thank you, Tom. It was very helpful, very insightful. I was wondering, did you have a chance to quickly digest the paragraph that David threw up on the screen? We could pull it up again. It was my weak attempt to try, one could say kick the can to somebody else who have more expertise than this committee to come up with some guidelines in the Joint Fiscal Office and the Joint Fiscal Committee. But to have, I think, consistent with what you're saying, to have some guardrails in place and some second set of review of this, which could be a $90 million program. And I just wondered if I don't know if David's with us anymore, or if we could pull up that language, but
Yeah, I saw
Dave's
that.
here, and Joan had her hand up, and Randy too. I just wanted to let you, in case you didn't see them.
I do see both of them.
Okay, great.
So just if you could comment on that language, maybe David could throw it up on the screen again.
Yeah, I think it's better than not having anything. But when I think about, a grant is a different kind of thing for the state to do than a loan or, various other types of subsidies that can be tax credits or various things like that. The disbursement of cash to for-profit enterprises is something that should require a fair amount of scrutiny and a pretty high bar. There is enormous potential for both waste and also criticism of favoritism and crony capitalism and things like that around this. The only program that's doing this in a substantial way is VEPSI with the Veggie program, and they give these projects a lot of scrutiny. They have them come in and explain what they're doing, and they review a lot of data, and they try as best they can to discern whether this money's really going to make a difference or not. And then they proceed. They've got clear clawback mechanisms. If things don't work, the state has built in a lot of protections. And that's maybe $10 million a year at the most. So this is an enormous undertaking, and I would just be very careful about that much money flowing out without very much scrutiny, analysis, or review. Many of the applications, I'll say, we've reviewed to date have had extraordinary number of ridiculous data inputs that are just not credible, and we've had to go back and talk to them and revise it 2 or 3 or 4 times. It's not a simple, easy process, and I don't think it should be for that amount of money. I think you're muted, Michael. Michael, I think you're muted.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you're muted, Michael.
I apologize. I was saying, why would you think if we change the law as being proposed, that the agency couldn't do that same, provide that same scrutiny? Is there any evidence that they wouldn't?
Yes. Throughout this process, essentially the ACCD representative on the Economic Review Group and the clear preference and pressures from other ACCD personnel have always been to increase the amount. That there always has to be a higher, amount. Doesn't matter whether it's data supported or anything else. So I think that's, I just think there needs to be another set of eyes on it. They have very good contacts on the ground. They have good outreach through regional development corps people and all the rest. So they know, they're familiar with a lot of projects. They can provide information. But a lot of times you scratch your head and you say, well, if this guy gets the following thing, why doesn't everybody get something like that in that sector? And, so who comes in first with the application? Why do they get state aid? Are they competitive with other state entities? And you're funding then an entity that's getting state money and has a competitive advantage over somebody who didn't apply and didn't get their application in, and therefore suffers because of it. That was a very difficult conversation on cannibalization in general. And it was, Jeff Carr understands it. Anybody who does economics understands it. Didn't fly with a lot of others. But I don't want to get into all that detail. I think we can do that when we have actual approved projects and all. But I do think it would be useful to have, another lens through which this process and these awards can be viewed.
Can I just say something?
Yes. First, committee members, are there any questions from committee members?
Well, I think you didn't fully answer the question, Tom, to the chair's question about the scrutiny that the agency brings to it. But I think Joan is probably chomping at the bit to respond, so I'm going to not speak.
Well, there's just a couple of things I want to clarify. The secretary does not have discretion over the dollar amount of the award. I just want to be absolutely spot on clear that we are constrained by NFI.
Joan,
the other
excuse
thing,
me.
I'm not sure if it's been discussed already, but net fiscal impact model, and correct me if I'm wrong, is driven by payroll. These are capital investment projects. Therefore, the entity that's trying to provide refugee resettlement housing is getting a very low net fiscal impact. So it's not that we don't like the model. We just think that it's misplaced in an economic recovery, and we'll all agree this is an economic recovery pot of federal money with pretty stringent constraints.
So
Do we agree with that premise?
Let me interrupt because we talked about this at length before you got here, and there's somewhat of I think it depends how you read the statute. If you read it as David Hall reads it, there is discretion with the secretary, and I also said that clearly the way we wrote it is we put a lot of emphasis on return on investment, so we can see how you might have interpreted it that way. But
No, actually, it's a section C1. An award shall not exceed the lesser of 1.5 million or the estimated net fiscal impact of the project based on agency modeling. Otherwise, if that were the case, I wouldn't be such a pain in everybody's butt.
Well,
we had discretion. Are you kidding?
Okay. I don't think we need to debate this because I think the committee is in a place where we're going to change that procedure because there should be other considerations other than straight dollar savings to the state, so that language needs to be.
Yeah, in fact, ARPA rule actually doesn't really state that the state should be making money on recovery money.
Right.
That's the other disconnect. That's just general.
So-
But I do take exception that we're giving ridiculous applications to the economists. We
Okay.
did a solicitation by state statute. We had to do a rolling application for 90 days. And we weren't sure because the technical team did not tell us precisely the amount of information needed. So there has been a lot of back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to clarify, Michael, that I'm not a lawyer. So when David said Joan has discretion as he reads it, I'm assuming he's an attorney that knows that. So if that's not the case, that is that's a big deal either way. So maybe David can clarify that. I'm not, the legal side of it's not my cup of tea. So.
Well, I think what David was saying is that who gets the awards is discretionary ultimately with the secretary. The amount of the award may be controlled by the section that Joan says, but I don't think we need to labor that because I think we've heard enough that we think that there should be some flexibility to look at other factors other than the bottom line in terms of the amount of the award. So
Yeah, the reason that would be important.
I don't know if David, you want to add anything to that? Okay.
I mean, the reason that would be important, Michael, is simply that these awards haven't been granted. So if Joan has more flexibility, then she is reading it as, if there's a legal point, that would change the awards that have yet to be granted in this first round. So it does seem like a big deal to me.
Well, except it may be the authority as to which award she gives as opposed where she lands, as opposed she may have some restrictions on the amount that she can give out to that awardee. So that may be the difference in the interpretation.
Yeah, we're not that lazy that we didn't review whether or not we had discretion, with all due respect.
Okay. Senator Clarkson.
Yeah, I think at some point it would be very helpful for Joan and Brett to share some of to illustrate this challenge for us, because I think the committee, I think you're right, Mr. Chair, that we're landing in a place where net fiscal impact is a bit of a challenge as we look at recovery money, but it is. I think a couple illustrations of this would be really helpful because they have a lot of work that they've worked on already, and we have a couple examples without betraying confidential understandings in the program. But I think you can do some general illustrations of where this is a challenge. So at some point, I'd like to have Joan and Brett share some of those, because a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Okay, just to put an end or a period to this conversation, it was also said when you were not here, Joan, that this program was represented to this committee as quite a different program than it is now. It was talked about big projects, no limits, transformational. Everything was about. A lot of it was about the economic benefit to the state. So I don't take any.
Yeah, I agree. Look, at the time,
on return when the program was sold to us originally. So,
understood. Yeah, I mean, the idea was with this opportunity to get money, wouldn't it be smart for us to build so that we could reap future returns? Before this, all we did was economic assistance. So it was really a question of getting to long-term recovery. That was the intent. And many of the projects, it is long-term recovery because it may be a museum adding on, additional space, or a performing arts venue, or a childcare. And despite what economist Cavett has said, there is a huge need for construction of childcare. And, we're in economic development. Why would we not be talking about construction? There are others that will talk about the subsidies, and we'll talk about, raising the rate of pay for the childcare workers. But right here, right now, in this program, it's about construction. I mean, I probably said enough, but yeah, back to Senator Clarkson's idea. Yes, refugee resettlement. This person asked for $60,000. They're probably going to get 12. childcare.
Let me just
Childcare,
break in, Joan, because
500,000.
that's not true. We had a
Okay.
conversation about that refugee resettlement applicant, and there's a clear labor force connection there, a really meaningful one, and that is being reviewed right now for what that impact might be, and that swamps any of the little renovation impacts from that. So that is an
Okay.
example of one that does have an externality that's probably measurable and would be significant. And I agree,
Okay.
that's definitely, you know, even if it weren't an economic impact thing, it'd be great if there was more discretion to say, yeah, you think that's important. Anyway, I don't know if we want to debate all the
No,
little
I'm
individual
just-
words, because I can bring up 50 or 60 and so can you. But it's not, they aren't settled. It's not done.
Element of the conversation. Senator Brock, do you still have a question?
You're muted, Randy.
My overall question is, as I've listened to the various pieces of the debate between the auditor, the economist, and the agency, it seems very clear to me that this is not working. It seems very clear to me that the guardrails and what kinds of guardrails we need in a program like this are not working. It seems that we need a better process to ensure that they are. And so the first thing that I want to do is I want to ask each of the people here as to how do we fix this? And in particular, I know that the notion of doing something like we do in VEPSI, of having in effect an outside board that does a due diligence on projects, that's one thing that does seem to work. At the same time, we're faced with time constraints. And the need to move quickly as opposed to lethargically. And so is there a way to do that to give us what we need in the time frame we need, but with the comfort that we need? So that's one. I realize that having someone looking over the shoulder of an agency while they're doing something may be difficult on the one hand, but if there are clear guidelines, it may be sensible on the other. And the auditor is not the person to do that, because the auditor can't build a program and then subsequently come back and audit it lately. And so thoughts along those lines would be helpful. I think Senator Clarkson mentioned a picture is worth a million words. That's true. Of the kinds of things that have been mentioned, of absolutely absurd applications that are being seriously considered, we'll see if any of those are actually funded, because this is an interim thing that we're talking about. I'd like some specific examples to know what we're talking about, because the words don't give me a clear picture of that. I'd like some clear examples. And to the extent that the economist, that Tom, you can provide that, perhaps screened through either ledge counsel or the agency to ensure that you're not violating confidentiality procedure. If there are egregious kinds of things, I'd like to know what they are, because it makes your testimony much more credible to me. And as far as the agency is concerned, if you think everything is fine and it's going well the way it should, please tell us that. But if it's not, and there's something that needs to be fixed, tell us what it is.
Okay, I think they have, in fairness to the agency, they have a plan in front of us as to how to
Right.
go forward. So Mr. Hoffer, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Just real quick, the question, the continuing concern about the level of awards is not surprising. However, as I said before, those awards are required by rule to be proportionally responsive to the economic harm measured. And I'm not sure that the agency, for its part, has information sufficient to estimate that figure, because it didn't look like the application asked for validated data. It asked them to describe the harm. Well, that's a self-attestation. That's not, objective, verifiable data, unless I'm missing something, unless they did provide that. I just say that because that's the way the program is supposed to work. The need, the purported need of the applicant is great. And all this stuff may be suitable and appropriate and exciting, but if it's not proportional to the economic harm, it's not permitted.
So I could respond to that. I mean, We have been getting guidance from Guidehouse about each and every application. So, you know, each applicant will have to provide us documentation in terms of as we go through the grant agreement process. It's not, they're not providing everything up front. However, if they're a hospitality entity that is going to end up getting a fraction of what they asked for, it's definitely proportional to their loss if they were closed for months and they're not reopened. So, you know, there are elements, we have elements of their eligibility from the application process. And then once we finally make determinations, we will be meeting with each of the applicants, telling them exactly what is required. Because we can't keep applying. This has been out since September. People are asking what the status is. We're still waiting for externalities. So I could give examples. I could illustrate childcare asked for 700,000. They're getting possibly 87, unless that changes. You know, we've got another childcare center asked for 320. We're going to, their NFI is 20,000. I mean, the reason for the upward pressure or the pressure that you're hearing from the agency is whether or not an award of $20,000 to a childcare facility is going to do anything for them. So it's not just that, oh yes, we just want to give more money.
No, but you could, but if you can't justify 300,000 or 600,000, then it's a moot question.
Yeah, but
They
the
might
justification
they might
proof,
want or need that
the
much. But that's
justification
not what
proof-
this program is about.
This program is about economic recovery, and childcare is one of the avenues that serves households, and households with children were disproportionately impacted.
That's
So
true.
there's impacted industries and disproportionately impacted industries.
Right.
So yes, we feel that there should be more upward pressure on it. It's not like we want a blank check and just send checks out. And I actually take exception to that type of connotation that we are being careless. Anything but. The entire staff is working through this. We're working with Guidehouse. The state pays a lot of money for that. It's not, there is nothing frivolous about this. And any connotation to the opposite, I really take exception to.
Okay,
Here's another one, hospitality and lodging. They're going to purchase and install replacement HVAC. 506,000 is requested. Fiscal impact 125. That is actually a permitted use under ARPA statute, and we're unable to give them that. We also were never going to fund an entire project. They had to provide 50% match. So
Actually,
I
I'm a
agree
little,
with
I'm a little
Senator
curious.
Siraki.
Commissioner, I'm a little curious. You're saying, you said repeatedly that you're not permitted to give them that. I don't understand that from the language of the statute at all. This is guidance to the agency. I don't think it says that the NFI is determinative.
Oh, yes, it does. Oh, yes, it does in several
I don't think so.
places.
We
Oh, yes, it does.
I'm going to call an end to this because this is the third time we've gone around this issue. I think that the language may say that in terms of the amount of the award, you can't give out more than the NFI. And, you know, we were led to think that that was a good idea back last year when we were doing huge transformational projects that were going to change the economy. The grants have now been, this program has changed as a result of in part of the federal guidelines. And we are going to probably in this bill allow for more discretion in the amount of the award. As our council has said, there already is a discretion as to who gets the award in terms of prioritization. But I take Joan reads that section and David didn't disagree with it, that the amount of the award may be restricted. So we've talked about this and we have a solution. And I don't think anybody's at fault for it. And I think that what we did was very responsible given how we were sold the program last year. So let's, unless there are committee questions, it's been a very lively morning, 11:50. We could all use a break, and I will be meeting with Senator Clarkson and Scott for agenda planning right after this. But I really want to thank you all. I think despite some of the tension, it was very illuminative. Yes, Senator Brock.
Just wanted to add, we talked about a couple of specific examples today, and the childcare and childcare center was one of them. And I'm left a little bit confused because on the one hand, it was raised that, well, one of the ways to deal with this is perhaps put money in the hands of people who could pay additional money so that the wage rates that seem to be a great deal of the problem can be dealt with. The concern there, of course, is we can do that conceivably right now. Whether we can do that with this pot of funds is something else. But what happens when the federal funds go away? Are we any better off than we were before? On the other hand, I hear the agency saying, well, we're going to put money into constructing child care facilities that others have said we don't need because the problem is people and not the facility in the first place. It's trying to reconcile those thoughts that, frankly, to me are a big, big dilemma as I look at this program and I look at what we're doing. And I would appreciate input from any of the people who testified here today in response to how we deal with that question. I know we don't have time to do with it today.
I think Let's Grow Kids has a very good report about what is needed, both in terms of new facilities, workers, the entire package. And I think they would love to come in. And some of these childcare centers have already contracted out with known contract childcare providers that would actually operate the center. So, it's not just they're going to build something, it's going to be empty.
Well, I would appreciate if somebody could get back to the committee with a short response, perhaps, to Senator Brock's questions as he posed them. I see some nodding. It might be good to have for us to have that in our file. So just by way of, the goal is probably to get this bill out by crossover, though there may be opportunities to get some sort of extension if need be. So thank you all very much. It has been an interesting morning. I think we all could use a break, and hope things go well in your travels, Tom. And
Well,
Auditor, I will see you soon.
yeah, and
Indeed.
good luck with family crisis out there. Thinking of you.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Brett.
Thanks.